Ain't no surprise I didn't get these scars from falling over in church. I told some lies, broke some laws and ties instead of good hard work. When I die, I'll take nothing that I took down in the dirt. Lord, I'll cry and I'll be avenged by all.
Well, hello there. Happy New Year. I hope you guys had a great Christmas and everything. We are now, 2 weeks into the new year? So half the world has already given up on their New Year's resolutions, and a few people are just starting to make them. And I kind of wanted to take a break today from what I had been talking about with the health stuff. Not necessarily health stuff, but the very specific health talks, and talk about something a little bit more general, kind of specific to health, but genuinely something that has been on my mind a lot lately for myself and others, as well as just something that's going to be really beneficial to you guys and gals out there as you start or struggle to start your change, whatever change that might be. And this is honestly one of the most difficult things for me to learn, because at my core, I am a people pleaser. And not just externally, but self-seeker in pleasure, I guess you could say. So I am not naturally a person who likes to do hard things. I'm not naturally a person who likes to be in pain or be hurting or anything like that. And I kind of had to learn to love it over a few years. And then once you get into a place where you're in pain, not because of your choice, you kind of learn to hate it. Just waking up hurting all the time. But what I really wanted to talk about today was the process of teaching yourself to say no. And I guess when properly to say yes would be the opposite end of that. But I know that for me personally, learning to say no was a huge change in my life that took forever to really figure out. It took until almost 30 years old to figure out how to tell myself no. I was like 27 going on 28 before I really figured this out. And when I say figured this out, I mean learn how to initially tell myself no, because it's one of those things that the more often that you do it, the stronger that skill becomes, but the less often you do it, the weaker that skill becomes. And over the last few years, I have not been great at telling myself no. I've kind of just had a pity party over being hurt and being like, oh, well, I can do this because I'm hurt. It's like like I said, it's that pleasure seeking. And what was doing it for me wasn't doing it anymore. And that old life that's like magnetic started pulling me back and pulling me towards those things again. And it's not necessarily something that I have figured out, but it's something that I know to be true. And I'm trying to figure that out more. But when I started this whole journey in 2017 of figuring out who I was, figuring out what I wanted to be, figuring out why I was so unhappy, it was often because I was saying yes to too much or saying no too often. So there's a healthy balance in there of trying to find a place that is not completely isolating because you've said no to everything, but also that you have that important time to yourself. You have those things that are important to you, those goals, those ideas that you want to achieve in your life, and you're going to have to learn to say no to things. And it's not just external things. It's learning to set boundaries with yourself as well. And for me in my personal life, because I want to make sure that you guys understand the things that I ask you to do are really fucking hard. And I don't ask you to do anything that I haven't asked myself to do. I'm not asking people to do anything that isn't possible because I've done it and I'm trying to do it again. But in my personal life, learning to say no started with two things for me: food and drugs and alcohol. Now, those two things, or two sets of things, were completely interchangeable in my life. It's like, well, I'm trying not to do drugs and alcohol, so I'm just going to eat myself into oblivion. Or when I'm doing drugs and alcohol, it's easy for me not to eat because I'm getting the pleasure that I want from this other external source. And that's really hard to admit. It's hard to admit that you're kind of like a junkie, even though you're trying your best not to be. And over the last 2 months, I have had to do some very deep soul searching that I haven't found an answer to necessarily. It's not like I've come to this point of arrival and now here is all the information and I'm laying it out to you. It's just more of trying to put it in some sort of order that helps people, including myself. Thinking about these things and taking the time to really think out where I'm successful, where I'm not successful, where I'm good at saying no, where I'm good at saying yes. All of those things are very difficult to continue to practice out at first. They get easier and easier as time goes on. But for me personally, it was this vicious cycle of eating myself into oblivion or drugs and alcohol to numb the pain of life. And a lot of people are probably wondering, like, well, what kind of pains of life do you have? You went to private school growing up. Your parents were not poor, not super wealthy, but upper middle class. Like, what pain did you have? And that's the thing is, like, I wish I had something to point to other than my own stupid, fucked up head that was, like, out there. It would be easier in a way. But from the time I was a little kid, I've always just had this, and I don't necessarily want to call it a darkness, because a darkness makes it sound like it's something evil or just not necessarily good. But I've always had this something in the back of my head that has just not allowed me to really be free. And I'm not saying that I am now free and figured this out. I'm working on all those things, and I'm trying to find a pathway towards freedom from myself in a way. And that's what I'm trying to help you guys find based on the things that have worked for me, the things that have not worked for me. But when you're a little kid and your nickname is Eeyore growing up, from the time you're like 2 or 3, there's obviously something about you that is a little bit different. And I don't know if that was something spoken over me that eventually became who I was, or if it was just that I didn't have this natural inclination towards joy and happiness. I've always been a very skeptical person. I've always been a very, I don't want to say pessimistic person, but my first response is to doubt and poke holes in things versus believe and accept things. And the first time I always take in new information, I'm always trying to rip it apart. I'm trying to destroy that information as best as I can, because whatever holds up there at the end is probably worth something. If it can withstand a high level of scrutiny or even a low level of scrutiny, because sometimes things fall apart just in the first little bit of scrutiny that you give them. But if they can withstand the scrutiny of what I declared to be good in a way or truthful in a way, then it probably held some merit. It probably was worth listening to. And I don't know where that came from. I've just kind of had this overwhelming sense of needing to find the truth or the justice in everything. Fairness was always important to me as a kid, and that has stuck with me into adulthood. And I don't I don't recommend it. It's not necessarily the best way to go about life, is to constantly be skeptical of everything and everyone. But at the same time, you kind of got to be on your P's and Q's and pay attention to the information that you're taking in, the things that surround your life, in order to really understand who you are. Because you don't want to be 34 going on 35 still trying to figure out who you are. I think that our generation is struggling with this identity crisis a little bit more than any other generation. I can't even imagine the following generations, what they're going through, because the institutions that were falling apart during my generation, the wheels have come off now. They're completely fallen apart, and there is very little to hold to. There's not necessarily this bulwark anymore that you understand, like, this is the limits, or this is absolute truth. And that is outside of maybe religion, outside of those things that people hold very near and dear as absolute truths. So, but learning to say no in general has been one of the most beneficial things that I have ever learned. And it started first with learning to say no to myself. And as far as looking at this, let's call it boundaries. So there's really two types of boundaries that I want to talk about today, and maybe this will encapsulate everything, but intrinsic and extrinsic. So boundaries that you set with yourself, and boundaries that you set with the world outside of you, the people outside of you, the things that the world offers. And ultimately, learning to say no starts with the intrinsic boundaries that you set. So it is going to be impossible for you to say no to the things of the world, the people around you, the stuff that is out there, if you can't learn to say no to yourself. And what is the purpose of saying no to yourself? Well, you're probably having behaviors that you're not happy with, that you want to learn to say no to yourself about. You want to no longer be affected by those things in the way that they affect you now. For me, food, drugs, and alcohol. Those were my big issues that I had to learn to say no to. I still have to learn to say no to. Like, I would much rather just smoke weed or take pills or do something to relax than like just try to fall asleep normally, or just try to have any amount of relaxation, because I know the comfort that brought me. And learning to say no to that comfort was and is a painful process. It's not something that you ever really grow out of. It just becomes a little easier to say no every time you say no, until you're no longer asking the question. Because that's really what it gets down to, is when are you going to stop asking yourself this question? So like when I'm starting to set up internal boundaries or intrinsic boundaries, it sounds kind of like, I'm no longer going to do blank, or I'm going to make blank a priority and set time apart in my day for this. So when I'm saying I'm no longer going to do this, it's very easy to wake up in the morning and be like, I'm no longer going to eat carbs, or I'm no longer going to smoke weed, or I'm no longer going to drink alcohol. Well, that is the boundary, but what are the checks that you have along the way to keep yourself from getting there? And those are the important things that you have to do. And I'm going to get to those in a little bit, kind of understanding those things that get you there, but it starts with setting intrinsic boundaries, things that you draw a line in the sand for yourself and say, this is something that I'm not going to cross any longer. Now, for me, I'm going to make this specific, or for you, make it specific, but here's a specific example of, like, if I'm trying to lose weight and get in shape, I may need to change the way that I eat and change the way that I spend my free time. So a boundary that you might set for yourself may be that I'm no longer going to eat out. I'm going to cook all my food at home. Now, that might be a soft line. That might be a hard line. It depends on where you're at, and it depends on how high on the priority list that boundary needs to be in order for you to actually achieve what you want to achieve. Now, setting those lines is going to be specific to everybody. There are yes, you can set that line, and a lot of people have set that line that I'm not going to eat out anymore. But what are you going to do to prevent that? Are you going to set some time aside on a Sunday to prep food for the week so you know you have food at the house? Are you going to fill your house with good groceries or bad groceries? Like that, those boundaries, they have levels to them. So even if you're only going to eat at home, what are you going to eat when you're home? All of these different boundaries that you set for yourself are going to require you to say no to certain things and yes to other things. You might have to say no to soda. That was a big boundary for me within food, was saying no to soda, because one, did I need it? No, it was a want. I could get by just fine with water and coffee, but I really enjoyed soda. So, for years of my life, there was no soda. And that boundary slowly disappeared over time, and it became less of a priority, and it's a problem again. I would love to stop drinking soda, but how do I get to not drinking soda again? So these are the things that you have to really think through fully of. Let's just use that as an example. So you want to quit drinking soda. Well, what is the reason that you drink soda? Is it because you like the sweet? Is it because you like the bubbles? Those are two different things. So if it's because you really like the sweet, and maybe you like both, and maybe that's the issue. But let's say you like that sweet something with your food. Well, if it's because you want something sweet, can you go with a 0-calorie, artificially sweetened drink, maybe a small amount at your meal? Maybe you're already only drinking diet soda in the first place, but the issue is that you're not drinking any water. So you might have to set a boundary of like, I am not going to allow myself to have soda until I've drank X amount of water. Or I can't have a soda with my meal unless I've had, water. Or it's a reward system where it's like, because I worked out, I'm going to have a Coke Zero with dinner, or whatever it is. So there's different elements to setting a boundary. It's not always a strict, I will never cross this. It might be that I'm not allowed to cross this unless, or I'm not allowed to do this unless. Learning to say no to yourself doesn't always have to be a hard no. It can be a not right now. It can be a later. Something that I always remind myself of is that I've had it before. It's not going anywhere, and it'll be there when I'm done. Like all the times that I wanted pizza while I was doing my fast, or all the times that I wanted food, it wasn't going to be gone. It's not like I was saying no forever, but I was saying no for this period of time in my life until I learned to have a better relationship with whatever it was. So for me, with food, drugs, alcohol, some of those have to be hard no's. Like, I can't allow myself to do this anymore. And I failed at those things. And some of those things are as simple as, hey, for the next 30 days, I'm going to do no soda. And at 30 days, I'm going to reevaluate to see if it's something that I'm craving, if it's something that I'm still struggling with. And if it becomes a problem again, then you have to cut it off. And you have to look at it and go, does this consistently become a problem? So when it comes to drugs and alcohol, for someone like me, alcohol I don't really struggle with, but because it's legal and more socially acceptable than, let's say, weed or pills or something like that, I might use that, or I might have used that in the past when I was trying to prevent myself from popping pills or smoking weed or something like that. And it was never really a top priority. So not drinking alcohol has been easy. It's not been difficult for me at all. Whereas I can't take a pain pill from the doctor anymore. And I had to tell, every time I have a doctor, the first thing I have to tell them is, you cannot prescribe me an opiate unless it's absolutely required, and you put a limit on what you give me, because it will start a chain reaction. Because it's like being hugged by God. Like, I lose all motivation towards anything. I lose so much of myself for those moments. And if I lose so much of myself for those moments, I start to enjoy that, because there's this lack of feeling, and I enjoy that lack of feeling in a way. So I have to set boundaries internally that also apply an external boundary. So what I mean by intrinsic and extrinsic boundaries is, the extrinsic boundaries start with the boundaries that you set with yourself, and then they move outward. You don't start by setting boundaries outward and then try to close them in on yourself. No, you start with setting a boundary on the inside, and those boundaries are not just arbitrary boundaries. They're designed to push you towards your goal. So you don't set a boundary that doesn't put you closer to your goal. And look, I'm using this practically with regards to weight loss, fitness, things like that. But the same thing goes with relationships. If you're trying to be happier, and that might be a dumb example, but I'm going to use it anyways. If you are trying to become a happier person, you might have to limit the content that you take in that is negative. You might say, okay, I'm going to delete the news app off my phone. I'm not going to go on social media anymore, because all I see is negativity on there, and it makes me unhappy. And I don't like that. Well, you set that boundary for yourself. It has external values to it. And then you might realize that there's certain people in your life that you can't be around, because all they do is bring out negativity in your life. So you set that boundary, and then that person pushes back against it and goes, yo, why are you being like this? Why won't you hang out with me? Why won't you do these things? People are asking questions, but guess what? The drugs are also asking questions. The alcohol, the food, it's you asking yourself the question about the thing. It's no different than the person asking you the question about the thing. You are the person in that situation. So you have to learn to say no to yourself first, and it will become easier to say no to other people. Now, a friend of mine once told me that if you say yes to everything, people will not respect your time. You need to frame your time as being limited in quantity. You can't say yes to everything, because you will completely waste all your time and energy. You have to pick your battles, in a way, is what I'm saying. And the learning to say yes is just as important as saying no, because there was a period in my time where I just said, period in time of my life, that I just said no to everything. Anytime someone wanted to hang out, no. Anytime someone wanted to do something, no. And it became a very isolated thing. Life became a very isolated thing. Now, the reason for doing that was that I had to put a focus on my priorities. And the issue was, the decisions that I were making needed to be changed, and it was very dire, the situation. It's like I'm 415 plus pounds, 420 pounds. I don't even remember. Somewhere around there, 412. I was fat. Let's just put it that way. I was really fat. And I did not know how to control myself yet in a social environment. So I had to say no to everything for a long time. And look, some people got an explanation and some people didn't. You don't have to explain your no always. It's important to explain it sometimes. But some of my friends understood, and some of them caught on to it. Like, hey, what's going on? Why you keep saying no to everything? And I had to explain to them, because they were a person of importance to me. Hey, I love you. I appreciate that you keep reaching out, but understand that for the next X amount of time, I'm going to be saying no to a lot of things because I'm trying to get my life under control, and it's out of control. And because they knew me, they understood that I was 100% correct in that my life was out of control and that there was a limit to what I could allow myself to do, because otherwise I would fall right back into that old set of patterns and that old set of behaviors. It starts with a respect for yourself and your goals. I know Jordan Peterson has talked about this a lot of times, that whatever you are aimed at is God in a way. And I'm not saying to make your health God, but what I'm saying is that if you set something of high importance and you aim at it and everything in your focus is aimed at that higher good, it will affect the decisions you make if that is true to you and if you believe that. But a lack of prioritization in your time, it's inevitably going to lead to you being constantly burned out, reneging on your goals and agreements with yourself and your priorities, and falling back into an old pattern of life. And I say this from 100% personal experience. This isn't like I'm just coming up with this stuff and just trying to fill space on a podcast here. I don't need to make these podcasts. It's not making me any money. It's just taking my time, and I enjoy putting information out there. But we've talked a lot kind of around the issue right now of setting the boundaries, but what are the boundaries set around? The boundaries are set around your goals. And it's not just like an arbitrary goal. It's, think about it bigger than that. Think about it as, if I got to write the story of my life and I was in charge, how would I want it to look? And that question's difficult. That's not something that I would think most people could answer off the top of their head. And if they did, I wouldn't necessarily trust that person's judgment on what they want for their life, because if you don't have to put deep thought into what your life would look like if you got to control everything, yeah, just start there. I'm not gonna go any further on that. But that's where you start, and you start by doing your goals, writing out your goals, writing out what is important to you. I know I've talked about this before, but SMART goals: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time sensitive. So to go through those one by one, the goal has to be specific. Don't say I want to be healthy. Define what healthy looks like. Is there a weight in mind, or is it a look to yourself? Is it being able to feel comfortable in your own skin? Well, define what that means. The more specific you are, the more details that you're able to provide yourself, that the easier it's going to be for you in creating steps that get you closer to that. So be very specific on what you want to achieve. Now, within those specifics, there needs to be something that you can measure. What doesn't get measured doesn't get managed. If you say, I want to lose weight, you need to be more specific. How much weight do you want to lose? Awesome. You want to lose 50 pounds. Now, can you measure the outcome of the work that you're putting in towards that? Yes, they have scales. They have all kinds of things that will help you determine if you are losing weight and getting closer to your goal. Now, if you cannot find a measurable aspect to this, maybe it is not an achievable or attainable goal. Maybe it is something that is not realistic. And the best way to determine that is by starting at the top. What is it? Specify, create your measurables. And now, achievable or attainable, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's possible, but is it possible for you? So if you want to lose 50 pounds, but you weigh 150 pounds, maybe that is not actually achievable or attainable. Maybe that's not realistic. So the relevant and achievable kind of go hand in hand. And I'm using those words attainable and realistic interchangeable with achievable and relevant because I find that they describe the sentiment better of what it means to actually set goals. If I am working out and I get on the bench press and I can only bench 150 pounds, but I say I want to be able to bench 250 pounds. Well, it's specific, it's measurable, it is achievable, it is relevant or realistic, but based on what I set the time sensitivity to, if I say I want to bench 250 by next month, well, then it no longer is achievable or relevant. It's no longer realistic because it now has fallen outside of the scope of what would be reasonably attainable within the time that I have given myself to achieve that goal. So the time that you allow yourself to achieve your goals is just as important as as anything else. Now, long-term goals, short-term goals, those are going to be handled a lot differently. I am a firm believer in micro goals. So you set a big overarching goal and you set small goals along the way that get you there, like checkpoints. If you want to lose 50 pounds, great. Start with 5. Because if you can't get off the first 5, how are you going to get off the next 5 and the next 5 and the next 5 and the next 5 and the next 5, all the way down to that 50 pounds? You have to start with something. And the longer reach that it is between rings on the ladder, the less likely you are to climb that ladder. I've given this example 1,000 times, but if I tell you, hey, you got to climb Mount Everest, you think it's impossible. But if I tell you just got to take the next 5 steps, that might seem a little more achievable. And when you finish those 5 steps, you can plan out the next 5 and the next 5. Or maybe as you're finishing that 4th step, you're already looking ahead to the next 5 steps. So understanding that you set goals, you set boundaries, and the reason you do so is because your time and energy is limited. You will wear yourself ragged if you do not learn to say no to the things in your life because you're going to be chasing things in 2 different directions. Now, when you first start saying no, it sucks. It's fucking impossible sometimes, or so it seems. One of the hardest things for me right now is that fasting has always been something that is super beneficial to my life, not just from a weight loss standpoint, but from a mental health and physical health standpoint. I feel better when I fast. I don't wake up hungry. I don't go to bed feeling hungry because I program my body into a certain way of living and it agrees. But when I don't set those boundaries on myself of I'm not going to eat before X time, I'm not going to eat after X time, I'm not going to snack throughout the day. If I don't set those boundaries for myself, then once again, I'm running out of time and energy. I'm no longer respecting my goals. But understanding the things that trigger me to want to be outside of those boundaries that I've set for myself is just as important. And so right now it's at a point in my life where often I have to make breakfast for my son. And it's hard. It's really hard because here's a perfect example. This last weekend, I, trying my best not to eat before about 12 or 1 o'clock because I've been waking up so hungry in the mornings because I've been snacking too much at night. So it's like this cyclical thing of the snacking at night leads to the hunger in the morning. The hunger in the morning leads to poor willpower and poor choices throughout the day, which leads to me, falling back off the wagon that night and snacking again. And it happens over and over and over. And you have to find a place to break that cycle and say, I am no longer going to cross this boundary. So the boundary has been set. Not going to eat before 12, not going to eat after 8, whatever it is. Now, the trigger is smelling the food that I'm cooking for my son. Now, my son needs to eat, and he's not asking me to eat because he's being malicious towards me resolving the goals. I can't say no to him. If it was my wife, I could say, hey, you're going to have to make your own breakfast because I'm trying not to eat, and that's going to really drive me up the wall. Now, that trigger for me is really, really difficult because when I see someone else eating at this current point where my self-control is lower than it should be, I have a hard time saying no then to myself. Well, they're saying yes, so I can say yes. So I can't do the same things that I used to do, which would be to remove myself from the trigger. I have to sit there and suffer. Now, when I feel this trigger of like, I want to eat something, usually it only lasts about 10, 15 minutes. And for that 10, 15 minutes, it sucks. I am having to talk to myself. I'm having to redirect myself. I'm trying to create distractions. I'm having to remind myself of my goals. It does not always work. But the more often that it does work, the easier it will become. Kind of staying on this food thing. Look at your life, understand the triggers that make you want to eat certain things that you don't feel you need to be eating anymore. Now, there was a time in my life where I would like to say there's no such thing as a good food or a bad food. There's just food choices that are less beneficial and more beneficial for you. I do believe there are bad foods. And in an attempt to try to fit in with this whole kind of PC crowd of things online, I believe that for a moment of like, yeah, there's no such thing as bad or good when it comes to food. It's just learning to say no. No, there are bad foods. There are foods that you should not eat, and it will be specific to you. There are foods in general that people should not eat, but we do. I don't think that anyone should eat Doritos, but they are so good. And it's hard when you're at a place and they got Doritos to be like, I'm just going to have one. Pretty much anything with MSG is hard to say no to once you start. So understanding those triggers of like, this is a food that I cannot touch because if I touch this food, I cannot stop eating it, or I don't have the self-control to tell myself this is all I get is this small amount. So yeah, there are bad foods. If you can't eat one slice of pizza or two, like whatever a reasonable amount is, let's say 2 slices of pizza, or maybe you make a frozen pizza at your house. It's 1,100 calories for the pizza and your meal is worth 600. So you can eat half the pizza. But if you can't keep yourself from eating the other half of the pizza, then maybe you need to just give yourself chicken and rice. And I do think that there is a certain element of desensitization that you have to have and that you will develop that will hopefully help you not crave those things and want those old things in your life that you know are going to be there when you're done. And when you have a better relationship with food, or you have a better relationship with family, or whatever it is, you're able to handle those things more. But there is a period of time where you have to say enough is enough, no is no, and I'm not letting this in or around my life any further. Now, when you feel triggered, it's that feeling of kind of like overwhelming compulsion to do something or to say something or to do something or say something. We'll leave it at that because I don't want to get too in the weeds on this topic. I want you to understand triggers from a practical thing. But let's say it's something like I see someone crack open a Diet Dr. Pepper, and maybe I'm trying not to have soda. Well, depending on how severe that trigger is, I might have to remove myself from the room temporarily. I might have to, go distract myself, whatever it is. But ultimately, depending on the orientation of my goals and my perspective at the time, whether it be long-term or short-term, I'm going to get through that. Goal orientation is a big thing. And what I would often refer to this as is healthy selfishness. So why if I'm orienting myself towards a goal, why? Because I determined that it's important to me. Now, should what's important to somebody else be more important to me than what's important to myself? That's a mouthful of nonsense there, a tongue tie in a way. What I'm trying to say is, why should somebody else's goals or desires be more important than your goals or desires for yourself? Now, you might have to check that against some people to determine, am I being selfish or am I being healthy? And that's why I call it healthy selfishness, because sometimes you say yes to things, sometimes you say no to things, and it doesn't always mean that it's a selfish act or a selfish behavior to put yourself first, but sometimes you need to put yourself first in order to stay on track with where you've oriented yourself for the goal. If the goal is important to you, then being conscious and aware enough of the goal to keep it at the forefront of your mind and orient yourself towards that on a daily basis, that will help you get through the triggers. Reminding yourself of why you're doing what you're doing. Now, it's not always going to work, and it's key to have a couple healthy distractions for yourself. And these are going to change. These are going to be specific to you. But let's say I am working on my computer, and downstairs I smell my wife cooking herself lunch. And maybe she is having lunch early at like 11. Now, my stomach immediately goes, oh, we got to go eat something. We got to go eat something. We got to go eat something. Now, I might start bargaining with myself and say, well, it's 11 o'clock. I guess if I could go eat something right now at 11, and then I could just cut off my eating at 7. Now, the thing is it the eating at noon that causes me to lose weight and the not eating after 8? It definitely aids in it. But the thing is it's less about saying no to yourself, and learning when to say no is less about, sorry, I want to make sure I word this correctly in the way that I'm thinking. It's about teaching yourself discipline. Of course, 1,600 calories is 1,600 calories, whether you eat 5 times a day or whether you eat once a day. It's 1,600 calories. It's 1,800 calories. Whatever your calorie goal is, whatever your goal for, whatever you're trying to achieve is. But once you start bargaining with yourself, that's when you know you're headed in a bad direction. You have to stop bargaining with yourself on things that you know you don't need to do, on things that you know that you don't need in general. Draw the line. Do not cross the line. It's set there for a reason. As soon as you start bargaining with yourself, you're going to be in trouble. Now, finding healthy distractions to keep you from starting to bargain with yourself isn't always easy. It's not always fun. But if I want a soda, I might go chug some water. Why? Because really, maybe I'm just thirsty and my brain's just latching on to the idea of that, just hearing that crack open of the can and going, all right, I can have a soda. It's got no calories in it, blah, blah, blah. But if you're trying to quit drinking soda or you're trying to drink it less, you can't bargain with yourself. You've already set the boundary. You now have to enforce the boundary. What's the point of having a fence if there's no gate or if there's a wide open hole in the gate or the wide open hole in the fence? It's like all you're doing is creating a place to funnel your problems through. I'll give you a few examples that were for me. In the morning time, when I was in the peak of my weight loss, I either woke up and read my Bible, woke up and walked around the block, did some walking, got myself up and oriented towards my goal right away. I wanted to be better in my mind. I wanted to be better in my body. I wanted to be better in my spirit. So as long as I did something that oriented me towards one of those 3 goals in the morning, I usually got through the mornings okay. Even if Megan ate breakfast, even if I was having a bad day, this wasn't always the case. Some mornings I would try to read my Bible and that wouldn't work. So I'd have to get out and go on a walk, or maybe I'd just go take a quick shower. Whatever I needed to do, I had distractions and I had fallback distractions, meaning that if this wasn't working, move to this. If this wasn't working, move to this. If this wasn't working, move to this. And generally by the time I got through that list, the trigger was already gone anyways, unless I was just trying to focus on it. Developing a set of healthy distractions will be one of the most difficult things that you can do, but it will be the most rewarding thing that you can do. I'll give you an example of something I would like to change, but I have not yet set a goal to change it. I personally would like to read more books. So, what is distracting me from reading more books? Well, YouTube Shorts. I don't learn anything from them. I just get pulled into the weeds on YouTube Shorts, watching some shitty cop try to enforce stuff that he shouldn't be enforcing, or, some epic fail montage, whatever it is. Like, it's just brain candy in a way. It's just gluttony for the brain. It's things that I don't need that I'm taking in because they're available. And that's gluttony in a way. Video games on my phone. I don't play Xbox. I don't play computer games. I used to at times in my life, but I had to get past that. And that one's been pretty easy to stay away from. I don't really have a whole lot of time to waste now that I have a kid on playing a video game. And for people who do, I genuinely don't understand how, unless you're just robbing Peter to pay Paul with your sleep all the time. But Diablo Immortal on my phone. And before that, it was Clash Royale. And before that, it was Brawl Stars. Like, it's always some little game on my phone that I would use in place of that. Now, part of that is that I'm not a good reader. I have to reread things over and over and over again for them to make sense in my brain. The words get jumbled up. I have a very noisy head. So if I have all these unhealthy distractions, if the goal is to read more and to play less games on my phone, I might have to delete all the games off my phone because they're an unhealthy distraction from my goal. If I'm trying to read more and I just start reading news articles instead of something that's actually worth reading, I might have to delete that news app off my phone, whatever it is. And I might have to constantly reorient myself towards that goal. Now, there might not be a healthy distraction that I can have for myself that makes me read more, but there might be some healthy practices that I can complete that would get me closer to a mind place or a headspace that orients me towards that goal better. And a previous podcast guest of mine, Jesse, and I have been meeting and talking about this stuff, and he's challenged me to probably one of the hardest things that I have ever tried to do, which is sit in silence for 2 minutes a day. And like, not just sit in silence. See, like, even in that, there's this anxiety that builds, like, just for 5 seconds. But it's trying to clear my mind and be silent, internally and external silence. External silence is easy. The internal silence is damn near impossible for me. And when I orient myself in that direction of peace and silence, it makes reading easier. But the comprehension stuff is still there and still a struggle. So healthy distractions might not be the best term, but I would say it's the closest thing that I can come up with that works to get you closer to your goals and understanding your triggers, and then having those fallbacks to those healthy distractions when you're triggered. Meaning that if I'm reading a book and my brain starts wandering, I might have to, that's the trigger in a way, whatever it is, something I read on the page triggered this thought in my head, and now I'm spiraling away from the book and my eyes are reading, but my brain isn't. I might have to draw myself back and go, okay, let's clear our head. Let's create room for this. Let's breathe it out. And let's start back at that paragraph again and let's get going. The last thing that I really feel is beneficial to any of this is the perspective. And we live in a very short-term perspective society. I fall victim to the short-term perspective quite often, meaning I will satisfy the now and give up the later. And that's not good. That's not healthy. Learning to reorient myself on the long term is generally what helps me achieve what I need to achieve and accomplish what I need to accomplish. I know I've given this metaphor before, but the burning the ships metaphor. And for those of you who are just hearing that for the first time, the idea of burning the ships comes from maybe Greek or pre-Greek civilization. They would show up, and when they landed on shore for battle, they would burn their ships. And the reason they would burn their ships is it was conquer or die. We are going to conquer this civilization that we have showed up to war with. Thus, we're not giving ourselves a way back out, or we're going to die trying. There was only one option. And when you give yourself too many options, it distracts yourself from the long-term perspective. So the long-term perspective being, going back to the beginning of the podcast, if I could write out the story of my life, what would it be? Where would I end up? How long would I live? Where would I live? How would I feel? What type of people would I be around? Anything that pulls you from that long-term perspective is going to continue to be a problem for you. You got to keep your eyes on the prize in a way. This has been an incredibly difficult podcast to record because I find myself feeling extremely hypocritical in the moment of everything that I'm telling people will help. This is something that I've been failing at for the last 2 years, as I've thrown a pity party over the fact that everything that I have worked for has gone to shit. And I hate that. And I do my best to keep myself pretty emotional, not emotional, on this podcast. But it hurts. Like, it hurts big time. And I'm disappointed in myself. And that disappointment serves as a reminder of me not being oriented towards my long-term perspective anymore, towards my long-term goals, and just seeking to satisfy anything in the moment. We're all in pain. Whether it's mental, physical, spiritual, we're in pain. We have things that cause us more pain than others. And unfortunately for a lot of us, we're in pain in all those areas. And when you learn to say no to the things that cause you to move away from this goal of being pain-free in a way, it does nothing for you. I genuinely believe that saying no is an important skill. When to say no, what to say no to, how to say no, and when it requires an explanation and not. But ultimately, if you do not have a vision of life for yourself that is worth saying no for, you're never going to get there. I'm saying this to myself right now and just happen to be recording it, but you will never get to what you want in life if you are constantly a slave to anything and everything. Any short-term distraction, any pleasure outside of things worked for. It's empty.
I've seen the damnedest things, man, in the damnedest ways. Said what I had to say to make it day by